Hello everyone! Today I'd like to discuss a video by the YouTuber MentisWave called How Taxing the Rich Taxes Everyone. I've chosen this video because it contains a laundry list of the reasons people will give you as to why taxing the rich is a bad idea. And so, it will make for a very good targeting ground to help clear various misconceptions people have around the policy. The video starts with a quote that alleges the whole idea of taxing the rich is simply a matter of robbing Peter to pay Paul. The video then goes into the idea of taxation in general, before he gives his first argument for why taxing the rich won't work, which goes something like so.
Let's start with the fact that the economy is strongly interconnected, and thus prone to something known as second-order effects, which is the reality that various policy changes and actions as a result of them can have additional indirect results that become more apparent over time. Basically just the reality that actions can have indirect consequences. Now sometimes second-order effects are good things, but a lot of times they're bad things, especially when it comes to the overall market. For example, a really common, well-known second-order effect that most people are familiar with is what happens when some kind of policy change results in the rise of the cost of gas, or oil prices if you want to be more specific. Because the economy depends on gas for transportation, this tends to affect a lot of other things. So for instance, an increase in this cost tends to lead to an increase to the cost of most goods at your local market, since those goods all need gas to be transported there, which then leads to everyone's cost of living to overall increase, which can then lead to less money being spent on luxury goods or recreations, such as less eating out at fancy restaurants. So whenever a sector of the economy that a large chunk of people depend on gets hit, it's very common for the rest of the economy to also take a hit, and for people to change their decisions and overall thinking about how they spend their resources based on how the economy has changed. Now, for taxing the rich, here's a more relevant recent example. This idea coming from the DNC of taxing unrealized gains, but only for assets worth more than 100 million, which means that's a perfectly fine way to get our free stuff machine rolling, right? I mean, most people don't have $100 million in assets that they're just sitting on, so naturally this won't affect you, right, bro? Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to be a little sarcastic for this video because these arguments are terribly economically illiterate, and yet these are, in fact, the arguments unironically coming from people who think this is actually a good idea. Apparently, since incentives don't exist in the alternative reality these people live in, here is what actually happens. First off, understand what an unrealized gain is. Let's say you buy some collector's item. For the heck of it, we'll just say some high-priced Fumo. Now, you buy it for $300, and a few years later, it's now worth $1,000. You could make $700 from the money you spent on your initial purchase if you sold it, but let's just say that you don't do that. Let's say you want to hold on to it for however longer you want. This would make it an unrealized gain of $700. Your asset here has technically gained more monetary value than what it was since you first bought it, but since you haven't sold it yet, you don't actually have the money. But you could have the money. So it is a gain, but it's unrealized, hence the term. But of course, that's just a silly oversimplification. In reality, the term unrealized gain is used more for the stock market and cryptocurrency exchanges. And in those markets, a huge portion of assets are held by people that some like to call whales. Now, whales tend to like buying and hoarding a whole lot of these assets, sitting on millions, sometimes billions of dollars in stocks and crypto for however long they feel like. And they do this for whatever reason, really. I mean, maybe they just like to look at the big numbers on spreadsheets. The point is, they have a lot of unrealized gains. If you look at their bank account, they don't actually have the monetary value of these assets as actual money. So what's going to happen when all the whales find out that they're going to be taxed on their unrealized gains? Well, to understand what the whales will do, let's pretend the unrealized gains tax was going to make you have to start paying a tax for owning your Fumo once it reached $1,000 in market value. Now, just what are you going to do to avoid paying that tax? That's right. You could sell it. Let some other guy on eBay deal with it. And that's exactly how the whales see things. Why on earth would they take on the risk of keeping an asset that earns the scorn of Uncle Sam? And so they sell off their earning shares before it reaches the threshold, or before this absolutely insane policy is put into action, especially since they might not even have the money to pay off that tax, since again, it's an unrealized gain. And this of course has some pretty major second order effects. Now, first off, it crashes the price for everybody else. So even if you don't have $100 million in assets, your assets are still going to be worth less because of this. But let's say that you have no assets at all. Let's say you're a member of the working poor. Guess what? It will still affect you because it will still cause a depression from the share value dropping so hard for everybody else. Because that means the value of a whole lot of stuff in the market that the stock market is based on is now crashed as well. And yes, I said depression, not recession. Good luck finding a job, buddy. And so that's the first basic problem with trying to tax the rich. A lot of the wealth that the rich have is based on the same assets that everybody else has. So it's very difficult, if not impossible, to just tax the rich without having some kind of ripple effect on the overall economy.
So Mentis argues that since a lot of the 1%'s wealth is tied up in stocks rather than in their bank accounts, they'll just end up selling their stocks to avoid paying a tax that they can't afford. This sounds like a good argument, until you consider some things. First of all, the proposed tax applies to people with $100 million in stocks. And you're not practically able to amass that many valuable assets unless you already had a lot of money to start with. Sure, you could buy a cheap stock ahead of the market and watch it accumulate in value, but doing that enough to be worth $100 million isn't something that's common unless you have a ton of money at your disposal. So the demographic we're talking about consists largely of people who have the cash needed to pay the tax on hand. Second, if you own stocks in a company, that business has to send you payments known as dividends. And if you own $100 million worth of stocks, well, let's just say the dividends would function as a pretty efficient means to pay the tax. Thirdly, Mentis acts as though nobody would want to own an asset that's subjected to tax. But that's just patently false. Property taxes are a thing, yet property prices are higher than ever. So clearly, just because an asset is taxed, that doesn't guarantee it'll be seen as something to get rid of pronto. The next argument Mentis makes goes a little like this.
Now, the next problem with taxing the rich is something called tax incidence. And tax incidence is an economic concept that looks at the reality that a tax doesn't necessarily impact the person being taxed. For example, if a fumo tax of 15% is imposed on people producing fumos, and the result is that fumos just rise in price by 15%, it is actually the fumo buyers who are paying the tax, even though the tax was designed to target production. So in some ways, tax incidence is another form of second-order effect, just more direct. Because the thing is, taxes often cause an increase to some kind of cost of production, despite no real changes to supply or demand. Because the thing is, when people get taxed, the issue with taxes is that people generally aren't immediately getting anything in return for those taxes. So at the time that they happen, it's really just a net loss. So taxes are something that people just kind of have to pay or else. And this means that the burden of the taxation often just gets passed around. So going back to the example of buying and selling fumos, the opposite could also happen. If a 15% sales tax on fumos was put into place, the demand might just go down, and so the people selling them may just be forced to, lower the price anyways. But of course, this is all about taxing the rich again. And when it comes to tax incidence, taxing the rich is the hardest of them all, because a lot of rich people happen to be CEOs and business owners and whatnot, which means that they control how the money flows in their own business. And this means that a CEO subjected to some kind of new tax can choose to just kind of redistribute where that tax goes. So for example, let's say Marissa, owner of Cernoflakes, is just doing her business one day and finds out that she, along with everybody else who makes over $1 million a year, is going to be subjected to a new 20% tax. Now, she could choose to eat this 20% tax from her own salary, or she could just raise her salary and then pay for it by either firing some workers or increasing the cost of Cernoflakes, thus passing the burden of the taxation onto employees and customers. And then of course, this decision happens in every single business where the owner makes over $1 million a year. And what this means is that the state really doesn't have a way to control who actually pays the taxes that they set. The state can control how much they steal and who they initially steal from, but they really can't control what happens next. Either the tax gets passed to somebody else through tax incidence, or the tax has some kind of ripple effect causing second or even sometimes third or fourth or fifth order effects on the economy as a whole. So this idea that the state can just target one specific group of people with a tax and have it only affect that group just isn't really a thing. This is why when politicians try to sell you the idea that they're going to give you free stuff through their brilliant strategy of tax the rich, they are lying to you. They are trying to bribe you with your own money. When you take into account how the overall market works, there's really no way they can tax the rich and guarantee it will only affect the rich. It's just not a thing.
Mentis basically tries to argue that if you raise taxes on the rich, the wealthy will just shift the burden onto the common folk by firing them or raising prices. This argument is a lot simpler to debunk, and we can do it by asking one simple question. If the rich could make more money by doing these things, why haven't they done it already? Think about it! The first thing you are taught in economics class is that if it makes money, business owners will do it. If someone is trying to argue that a policy will have a certain effect, you should always ask yourself, would the world look any different if they were right? I'm saying this because if you want to assume Mentis is correct, you would have to conclude that the basic idea that all of economics is based on is false. Now, as to why the rich don't actually do this, it's quite simple. If Marissa fired the workers making snowflakes, fewer snowflakes would get made, which means fewer get sold. If you raised the price of snowflakes, consumers would become less fond of the cereal, because, for better or worse, they're not made of money. So they'd start looking for more affordable options, which would give competitors with lower prices an edge up in the market. This isn't obscure economics. Like that last point was touted as an advantage of market economies in my Econ 101 class. Mentis' argument betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of economics. Let's get into his next argument.
But anyways, now that you understand why taxing the rich actually just hits everybody, we can move on to the third reason, which is the question of economic growth. Going back to that graph I showed earlier about average income and means tested transfers, which shows people of low income gaining more benefit from taxes, the main problem with this graph, and why it doesn't actually prove what it appears to prove, is that it doesn't account for one really big second order effect. And that is the fact that economic growth is really the main thing that matters for people's welfare, because that's what these means-tested wealth transfers really are. It is just a fancy way of pointing to various welfare programs, where your ability to get them depends on your income level. And what this doesn't account for is what people's income could be in a society with greater economic growth. Because as an economy in a society grows, the ability to satisfy people's wants and desires also grows. So an economy with better growth than another will be able to satisfy people's food and housing costs at a much lower rate. And the thing is, this is much more beneficial to the poor than really any welfare program we've come up with. And while it is not entirely accurate to measure economic growth in GDP, this is a case where GDP can be used as a measurement tool to show just what this means. For instance, I saw this recent post on X from Kramix that showed that a decrease of economic growth in just 1% in GDP would make the United States as poor as Mexico today, starting from just 1980. Now, admittedly, when it comes to this kind of growth, 1% is a lot higher than it sounds. But it gives you a decent comparison, because even today, it is significantly better to be of the working class in the United States than it is to be in the middle class of Mexico. And of course, if you were to compare the average person's ability to satisfy their basic desires in the United States today, compared to say United States 80 years ago, and you'll see very similar differences. A society that focuses on economic growth is by far, by a massive, massive margin, the absolute best thing we can do for the working poor. And how exactly do you focus on economic growth? Spoiler alert, by not taxing the rich. The countries with the most economic freedom are regularly the ones that have the best levels of economic growth, whereas the more corrupt and kleptocratic a state is, the worse off the poor are. And the reason this happens is really just basic economics. With less taxation and regulation, the private sector is able to focus its attention on producing better goods and services, which then lowers costs for people overall, as the society is better able to meet people's needs, which then gives people more resources to spend on more subjective desires.
So Mentis here is arguing that economic growth is better at helping the poor than raising taxes, and that raising taxes will hinder economic growth. Now, Mentis was kind enough to give us some handy-dandy sources for his claims, so let's take a look at them to see what all the fuss is about. His first source goes into what does and does not constitute economic growth. We're going to discuss this source later for reasons that will become clear as we proceed. The second is a blog post where I got the graph that compared the difference between America's GDP and Mexico's. The last one is an article from the humorously named Fee that uses data from a group called the Fraser Institute to argue that big government is bad for the economy. So let's have a look at that data and see for ourselves what it has to say. The Fraser Institute's report is called Economic Freedom of the World, and it rates how economically free different nations are based upon 5 factors, which I shall go over in numerical order. 1. Size of government. 2. Rule of law. 3. Sound monetary policy. 4. Freedom to trade internationally. And 5. Regulation. The Institute says in its report that high-income countries score high in rule of law, sound money, and international trade, but that they score lower on government size and regulation, which is basically a way of refraining from outright lying about the fact that high-income nations tend to have big governments and strong regulations, while still sugarcoating the facts enough to ensure that many people won't notice the truth. They also point out that the opposite is true of many low-income nations. So basically the source Mentis uses to argue big government is bad for the economy functionally says the opposite. Now, Let's get to that article that goes over what constitutes economic growth that Mentis cited, shall we? The article, from the Mises Institute, defines economic growth not as an increase in GDP, but rather as an increase in the economy's ability to satisfy people's needs. And if you go by that definition of growth, not only will taxing the rich not harm economic growth, it'll actually increase it. You see, social programs like universal healthcare will ensure that poor consumers will save money on healthcare spending, which means they can spend that money on other things, like fancy dresses or computers. If people buy more things, more stuff gets made. And if more stuff gets made, then companies are going to hire more employees to ensure that supply can meet demand. So very clearly, taxing the rich actually helps the economy instead of hindering it. So Mentis's fears are patently unjustified. Mentis's final argument is this.
And lastly, I'd like to throw in just a basic bonus reason for why taxing the rich doesn't really work here, which is that what you're doing is really just theft. It's just stealing from people who have more under the assumption that they somehow did something wrong to have more. It's just, in many ways, an extension of the equity fallacy, this incredibly incorrect idea that unequal outcomes imply unfair treatment or discrimination. And I know that this is more of an ethical reason, and more of a philosophical question, which is why I don't include it in my original count of the reasons in this video, because the first 3 reasons I gave are why taxing the rich doesn't work. But it's important to also understand that when a democracy decides to take from one group and give to another, that's really just theft by majority opinion. It's people deciding that you don't have a right to your property simply by majority rules. And thus it comes with this idea that people's rights can be taken away so long as the public can be gaslit and propagandized into believing that it's a good idea. And in this particular case, it's a very, very bad idea. It's impossible to actually tax the rich in a way that guarantees the rich actually pay the cost of those taxes, and in a way that guarantees the rest of the market won't suffer in some way, and especially in comparison to the face of economic growth, which shows that economic freedom actually reduces poverty way more than any kind of government tax the rich welfare scheme could ever hope to achieve.
Now, Mentis's argument reveals that he has some rather strange views on taxation. He seems to think that the governments want to tax rich people more is due to governments wanting to punish them, when it's really more a matter of rich people having more money, and therefore the government can gain more revenue from them. As for his argument that it's theft, I guess that's true, but I don't really give a fuck. If the government doesn't collect money through taxes, then we can't really have a working legal system, or roads, or any of the stuff we need for a functional society. I don't think paying taxes is fun either, but you can't really have a functional society without them. So, I don't know how to end this video, so I'm just gonna go out with a cut to black.